Hello, this is the first video I've made in a couple of years, I think, but I wanted to make a quick video about Meno's paradox and the presence that it has, the role that it plays in Augustine's Confessions. I'm doing this primarily for my dad because I want to be able to read the Confessions with him, to study it with him, and also maybe to teach it to him. But of course, he'll also have many things to teach me as well. So what I want to do just for the next few minutes is to explain how Meno's paradox is contained in St. Augustine's Confessions. So the first thing I need to do is explain what Meno's paradox is. And this is something that occurs in Plato's dialogue, the Meno, which is one of his early dialogues. And when I teach this to undergrads, what I typically say is that Meno's paradox is the paradox that you cannot search for something that you either completely don't know or something that you completely do know. In other words, let's say that I want to search for this cup. Strictly speaking, that's impossible because you can't look for something that is already totally within your grasp. If I'm focusing on the cup, I'm looking at the cup, I'm thinking about the cup, there's no way that I can look for the cup. So in order to look for something, it first needs to be something that to some extent you don't know or don't completely grasp. But on the other hand, if you have completely no idea concerning an object, if you completely and simply do not know the object, in that case also you're unable to search for it. After all, if I were to say, hey, I want you to go out and find a Yazzle-Cadoodle or a Killiagon, you probably will not be able to look for that object because you have no idea what it is. So this is Meno's paradox that that Plato draws out for us and develops for us in that dialogue called the Meno. And whenever I teach this to undergrads, I often talk about Donald Rumsfeld, who I believe was George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense. Famously, whenever he was talking about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, he spoke of known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And he used this little schema to address the issue of whether we know that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Interestingly, Donald Rumsfeld forgot to mention the most riveting of the four possibilities, namely unknown knowns. In other words, Rumsfeld forgot to entertain the possibility that maybe there are things that we know, but we don't explicitly know that we know them. Things kind of like Freud's subconscious. These are things that are deep inside of us, possibly in the deep recesses of our memory, possibly things like trauma, things that are inside of us. It's just that we don't explicitly know that we know them. And that's why we need things like psychoanalysis and counseling in order to draw them out of us, which is exactly what happens, by the way, in Plato's dialogue, the Meno. What you have is Plato and the Meno who are engaging a slave boy and asking him a series of yes or no questions, which eventually gets the slave boy to state the Pythagorean theorem. And what's interesting is that Plato and Meno do not pump information into the slave boy. Rather, they simply draw it out of him. They draw out of him that which was already inside of him, namely this mathematical knowledge that can be used to deduce the Pythagorean theorem. By the way, that's what education is. Exducatio is to draw out, kind of like a duct draws water and transports it from point A to point B. An aqueduct does that. The point of exducatio, or education, is not to put information into the student. but rather to draw the information out of it, to summon that which the student already knows, to summon that knowledge out of the deep recesses of the student's memory, and that process is called anamnesis. And that happens with a midwife, which is why people like Plato and Kierkegaard often speak of midwives and that maieutic process of drawing things out of people. Okay, so that's Meno's paradox. Now let's turn to Augustine's Confessions. At the very beginning of the Confessions, Augustine basically alludes to Meno's paradox. This is in Book 1. It's in the very first section of the very first section. It's in my version, which is Henry Chadwick, that I'm reading from an e-reader. It's the second paragraph. So I will read the second paragraph of Augustine's Confessions, Book 1. Grant me, Lord, to know and to understand. Which comes first, to call upon you or to praise you, and whether knowing you precedes calling upon you. But who calls upon you when he does not know you? For an ignorant person might call upon someone else instead of the right one. But surely you may be called upon in prayer that you may be known. Yet how shall they call upon him in whom they've not believed? Now there's already a lot going on there in those brief lines. But Augustine clearly has in view Meno's paradox. In other words, he's clearly saying, how can I know God? How can I search for God if it weren't for the fact that I already know something about God deep down inside of me? And we won't get into the Platonic notions of recollection in this video, but suffice to say that Augustine thinks that there is knowledge of God that is implanted in us from the deep recesses of our memory. And really the whole point of the Confessions, or at least one way of articulating the point of the Confessions, is that Augustine is rehearsing or remembering or putting together or narrating the story of his life in order to show how God was there from the beginning, and in order to show how his life is a process of God being drawn out of him, of him coming to know God more, to recognize the God that is already in him more and more, and to do that ongoingly. That's really what the Confessions is about. It's the narrative of Augustine's journey of remembering and coming more and more to know and to love the God that was already in him from the beginning. If God were not already in him from the beginning, in the deep recesses of his memory as an unknown known, then he wouldn't have been able to set out on a search for God in the first place. And that search for God is precisely what the Confessions is.